The door slammed like thunder, and the chandelier trembled as Jade Carter said, "Tell me why you brought me here if you plan to vanish." The penthouse smelled of cold rain and old secrets, and her phone glowed with unsent words. Malcolm Royce stood by the window, jaw set, a statue cut from night, and he said, "I thought distance could save us both." Jade laughed, one sharp crack, then swallowed it like broken glass. She traced the silk hem of her dress and said, "Save me from what? The truth or your pride?" The skyline bled neon into the storm, and his reflection trembled on the glass like a confession. He said, "I do not know how to want without burning everything I touch." Lightning stitched the sky, and Jade felt the seam in her chest pull open. Tasha Reed's voice echoed in memory, and she said, "If he runs, let him run, but do not chase smoke." Jade stepped closer and said, "I am not smoke, Malcolm. I am flame you asked to hold." His silence grew teeth and bit the room. Then he turned away and reached for the door. Jade said, "Leave if you must, but do not pretend this is mercy." Jade counted the thunder like heartbeats and said, "You think fear is noble, but it is only lonely." She remembered the rent notices, the late bus rides, and the way hope felt like a thrifted coat. Malcolm said, "I built a fortress because I learned love arrives with invoices." She almost smiled and said, "Then let me be the debt you pay with joy." The rain softened to a hush as if the sky wanted to listen. Tasha once said, "Dignity is not silence, it is the sound of your own name," said without shaking. Jade breathed in and said, "I will not shrink to fit your history." He flinched like the words touched an old scar, and his fingers left the door. The city neon pulsed and made a halo around his doubt. Jade said, "If you leave tonight, leave the story too, because I will not carry it for us." The elevator dinged faintly beyond the hall, a reminder that escape sits on every floor. Malcolm said, "People take from me until I disappear, and then call it love." Jade stepped closer and felt the warmth of him under the cold air. She said, "Then let me be the one who gives back what was stolen." He laughed without sound, and his shoulders sagged like surrender could be a language. Tasha's warning beat in her ribs and said, "Do not barter your worth for the chance to be chosen." Jade swallowed and said, "I am chosen by my own breath." The storm moved east, leaving the city polished and dangerous. Malcolm said, "You deserve more than this broken lesson." She nodded and said, "Then teach me something honest or let me go shining." Silence gathered like velvet and draped itself over their breathing. Jade said, "My mother taught me to pack before goodbyes." Malcolm looked down at his polished shoes like they might walk without him. He said, "I was taught to never linger where I could be hurt." Jade touched the glass and watched the city ripple beneath her finger. She said, "Hurt is a tax you pay for something worth owning." He winced and said, "I have owned too much and belonged nowhere." The rune held the echo and offered no rescue. Jade said, "Then belong here for one honest minute." His throat worked around words that would not behave. The rain stopped, and the chandelier stilled like a verdict finally arrived. The hallway light died as if the building refused to help him leave. Malcolm said, "If I stay, I must admit I am afraid of wanting you." Jade's breath steadied like a drumline finding tempo. She said, "Want is not a crime, hiding is." He stepped back into the room, and the door kissed shut behind him. He said, "I do not know how to start without breaking something sacred." Jade smiled small and said, "Start with truth, we can repair the rest." The city hummed like a choir refusing silence. Tasha's laugh flickered through memory and blessed the moment. Jade said, "Choose me now, not later, not safer." His eyes lifted, and the night finally felt like a beginning instead of a wound. Sunlight crept across the penthouse like an apology, and Jade said, "Morning changes nothing unless we do." Malcolm poured coffee that smelled like decisions and said, "I do better with contracts than confessions." She traced a ring of steam and said, "Then write the truth and sign it." He looked smaller without the storm, and his tie lay folded like a truce. Jade said, "I grew up counting coins and promises. and both came up short. He nodded and said, I counted losses and called it wisdom. The city throbbed below, urgent and goal. Jade said, I will not audition for a love you already cast as dangerous. Malcolm rubbed his brow and said, I want you, and it terrifies me. She breathed in hope that felt like risk and said, we can be careful and brave at once. He held her gaze and the room decided to be gentle. Jade wandered to the balcony, and the city breeze lifted the edges of doubt. She said, my mother worked double shifts so I could dream without apology. Malcolm stood in the doorway and said, my father left early and taught me to leave first. Taxi horns stitched a rhythm that sounded like possibility. Jade said, I do not need saving, I need partnership. He exhaled and said, I can try to share the wheel. She laughed softly and said, try as a start, but showing is the sermon. A gull sliced the blue and vanished between towers. Ania. Malcolm said, let me take you to the community center you mentioned. Her smile reached someplace tender and old. She said, then meet me where I was made. The community center smelled like floor polish and childhood victories, and Jade said, this place kept me from disappearing. Flyers lined the wall like testimonies. Malcolm said, it deserves better lighting and a roof that doesn't bleed. Jade touched the trophy case and said, I learned to speak here even when no one listened. A coach waved in passing, and the echo felt like home. Malcolm said, let me fund the repairs with no strings. Jade lifted her chin and said, no strings means transparency and respect. He smiled with the weight of learning and said, draft the plan and I will sign. She nodded and felt pride sit taller in her chest. The old scoreboard flickered back to life as if it heard them. Tasha arrived with a grin sharp enough to slice excuses, and she said, so this is the millionaire classroom. Jade hugged her and felt the years fold into laughter. Malcolm offered his hand and said, thank you for loving her before I had the courage. Tasha eyed him like a bouncer of the heart and said, courage is a verb, not a title. Jade said, we are building a plan for the center. Tasha nodded and said, good, but make sure the plan builds you too. The squeak of sneakers painted lines of memory across the floor. Malcolm said, I am willing to listen more than speak. What do you? Tasha smirked and said, start now, finance man. Jade felt seen and armored at once, and the room warmed around them. They gathered around a scuffed table that once held bake sale dreams, and Jade said, we need scholarships, transportation, and a summer program. Malcolm scribbled notes like a pen could bend fate and said, line items, timelines, accountability, done. Tasha tapped the table and said, add mental health support and safe rides after dark. Jade smiled at the symmetry of care and cost. Malcolm said, money is easy, trust is earned. She met his eyes and said, then earn it by showing up when it is not glamorous. The gym buzzer barked and made them laugh. Tasha said, look at you two turning thunder into infrastructure. Jade felt her chest loosen, like a door unlocking from the inside. The week opened like a bruise, and Jade said, progress tastes sweet, but I hear thunder hiding under it. Malcolm scanned emails and said, a board donor wants to meet us at the gala. She heard test in the invitation and said, or a trap with champagne. Tasha texted a prayer made of side-eye and said, wear armor disguised as silk. The city glittered with approval it had not earned yet. Malcolm said, Cassandra Vale funds my firm and likes to measure people with smiles. Jade steadied her breath and said, then let her bring a ruler, because I am not shrinking. He reached for her hand and said, stand with me and do not let go. The day stepped forward like a dare. The gala dripped with chandeliers and practiced laughter, and Jade said, rooms like this pretend to forgive and never forget. Malcolm's smile sharpened into strategy and said, we show purpose, not hunger. Cassandra arrived trailing cameras and said, so this is the voice moving your spreadsheets. Jade felt her dignity stand tall and said, This voice funds futures and asks questions first. Cassandra's eyes cooled like glassware. Malcolm said, "We want the center renovated before summer." Cassandra lifted a brow and said, "Convince me I am not buying a headline." Jade met the moment and said, "Invest in proof, not performance." The string quartet softened, and Cassandra said, "Your past will be audited like your budget." Jade heard old footsteps and said, "My past builds backbone, not excuses." A reporter leaned in, chasing friction. "Ah no?" Malcolm said, "Our plan is transparent and community-led." Cassandra sipped patience and said, "Then bring me guardians who will hold you accountable." Tasha arrived like a bell and said, "I count receipts and scars, and both balance." The reporter blinked, surprised by the steal. Jade said, "We do not perform poverty. We fund possibility." Malcolm's nod sealed the statement like a signature. By the terrace, wind braided music with rumor, and Jade said, "If she thinks fear lives here, she misread my pulse." Malcolm stared at the skyline and said, "She tests every bond I try to build." Tasha tugged Jade's sleeve and said, "A blogger posted that you are a vanity project." Jade felt heat climb, then chose breath over fire. She said, "We answer with work and witnesses." Malcolm said, "Tomorrow, we start repair bids and scholarship drafts." Tasha smiled like a shield and said, "I will line up parents to speak truth." The night cooled, but their purpose burned steady. As they exited, a familiar shadow detached from the valet line, and Marcus Carter said, "You forgot the man who taught you to leave." Jade's stomach dropped, then steadied, and she said, "I learned to stay without you." Malcolm stepped closer and said, "We are not repeating old abandonments." Marcus smiled thin and said, "Investors like clean narratives." Tasha moved between history and harm and said, "Clean starts with truth, not erasure." Jade lifted her chin and said, "You are not my storm anymore." Marcus shrugged, like wreckage was a hobby. The valet called their car, and the future opened like a door they owned. The drive home drummed with silence until Jade said, "Marcus never appears without cost." Malcolm kept his grip steady on the wheel and said, "He knows leverage better than loyalty." Streetlight streaked across her face like warning flares. Jade said, "He left debts and some carry my name." Malcolm's jaw clenched and said, "Then he will not use you as collateral." She leaned her head back and whispered, "Blood ties burn deeper than contracts." He reached for her hand at the red light and said, "I choose you, not the ghosts." She stared at his fingers curled around hers and said, "Then be ready, because ghosts knock hardest when you build new walls." The car rolled forward into a night sharper than glass. Morning broke thin and cold, and Jade said, "Letters keep arriving, each stamped with Marcus's shadow." Tasha spread the envelopes on the counter and said, "He's stirring trouble with creditors." Malcolm entered, tie knotted like armor, and said, "I'll settle this if needed." Jade shook her head and said, "No, settling teaches him I am still his child." Tasha crossed her arms and said, "Then confront him with receipts and witnesses." Jade touched the table edge until her knuckles paled and said, "I will not be shamed in my own name." Malcolm's voice softened and said, "We face this together or it will eat us alive." The sunlight caught the sharp edges of every promise, left unpaid. The meeting took place in a dim cafe, where whispers bought privacy. Marcus leaned back with a smirk and said, "Little sister, your success tastes sweet, so let me sip." Jade stiffened and said, "You left when water was poison, now you come for wine." Malcolm's eyes narrowed and said, "She owes you nothing but truth." Marcus flicked ash into an untouched cup and said, "Truth is negotiable when I hold paper." Jade leaned forward and said, "Your paper will burn in light." His smirk cracked for 1 second before returning like armor. Malcolm said, "You came for money, but you will leave with none." The hum of the espresso machine drowned the last thread of patience. Outside the cafe, rain slicked the street, and Tasha arrived like thunder in sneakers. She said, "You always crawl back when someone else does the building." Marcus laughed low and said, "Family doesn't erase, it collects." Jade's voice cut clean as glass. "Family earns its place daily." Malcolm stood close enough that his warmth steadied her pulse. Marcus said, "Investors love a scandal. I can be their headline." Tasha spat, "Headlines rot, but receipts stand." Jade lifted her chin and said, "Your shadow stops here." The rain thickened like applause, drowning his retreat into the dark. Back in the penthouse, Jade sank into the couch, breath shaking. She said, "He wants to ruin me because he cannot rebuild himself." Malcolm lowered beside her and said, "He cannot touch what you guard with truth." Tasha perched on the armrest and said, "Let him bark. We will answer with proof and progress." Jade's hands trembled until she pressed them together like prayer. Malcolm caught her chin and said, "I choose you even when storms knock." She met his gaze, the city's lights framing them like stained glass, and said, "Then we stand until the storm forgets my name." The room carried the vow like a fortress newly lit. The boardroom smelled of ink and polished wood when Cassandra said, "Rumors follow your name, Jade, and investors are restless." Jade steadied her voice and said, "Rumors die when results breathe." Malcolm slid papers across the table and said, "Here are the bids, the budgets, the receipts." Cassandra's sharp nails tapped once and she said, "But bloodstains do not fade with ink." Jade's jaw tightened and said, "My brother's debts are his, not mine." Silence cracked like a whip, and the room inhaled. Malcolm leaned forward and said, "Judge her by the work she builds, not the scars she did not choose." Jade's eyes glistened, but her back stayed iron. Cassandra studied her, weighed her, then leaned back into the velvet chair like a queen who found her challenger. The tension followed them into the elevator like a shadow. Jade said, "She looks at me like I'm currency she can trade." Malcolm pressed the button hard enough to rattle metal and said, "She cannot buy what refuses to sell." Jade exhaled sharp and said, "But her doubt spreads faster than my truth." The elevator hummed and glowed in polished brass reflection. Malcolm caught her hand and said, "Let them doubt, we will outlast." She whispered, "Outlasting feels like bleeding slowly." He turned to her fully, eyes raw, and said, "Then bleed with me, not alone." The floor dinged open, spilling them into a lobby that smelled of ambition and fear. That evening, the community center buzzed with voices, and parents filled folding chairs like a congregation. Jade said, "This place saved me, and I will not let scandal starve it." Applause rose like thunder. Marcus stood at the back, arms crossed, smirk sharp. He said, "Pretty speeches don't pay bills." Tasha stepped forward with folders and said, "Neither does abandonment, but receipts do." Malcolm faced the crowd and said, "Funds are secured, contractors lined, transparency guaranteed." Marcus barked a laugh and said, "But trust me, she'll fold like she always did." Jade lifted her chin, voice ringing. "I fold only when I choose, and I choose to rise." The room erupted with support that drowned his sneer. After the meeting, rain fell in sheets and Marcus cornered Jade beneath the awning. He said, "You think applause makes you untouchable." She squared her shoulders and said, "Applause is proof you're not needed." He stepped closer, menace on his breath. Malcolm pulled him back and said, "Touch her, and you answer to me." Marcus's eyes glittered with mischief, a millionaire knight protecting a girl from her own blood. Jade's voice cut clean, "I'm no girl. I am the woman who survived without you." The storm howled, lightning flashing her strength across his face. For once, Marcus had no words, only retreat. Later in the penthouse, silence pressed heavy. Jade said, "He is my blood, but not my anchor." Malcolm cupped her face gently and said, "You are more than survival. You are my beginning." Her tears slid, half sorrow, half relief. She whispered, "Every wound feels louder when love finally whispers back." He pressed his forehead to hers and said, "Then let me shout it. I love you." The words rang like a verdict too long delayed. Jade's voice broke but did not falter. "Then love me through the fire, not after." Their breath mingled, storm outside fading into the warmth of two hearts daring to trust. Morning folded softly over the city, and Jade said, "Last night was a vow, but vows need work." Malcolm set 2 mugs down and said, "I'm ready to labor where love lives." Steam curled like prayers, unafraid of daylight. Jade said, "The center's first repairs begin today, and fear is already early." Malcolm touched her wrist and said, "Let fear clock in, and leave unpaid." She smiled because his courage felt borrowed from her own. Tasha's text chimed and said, "Contractor crew on site, bring receipts and grace." Jade exhaled and said, "I will show up with both, and leave with dignity." Malcolm said, "Whatever breaks, we fix together or let it go together." The sun landed on their joined hands and named them honest. Inside the gym, hammers rang like drums, and Jade said, "Every nail sounds like a second chance." A foreman nodded and said, "Storm damage first, then lights." Malcolm reviewed estimates and said, "Transparency page goes live by noon." Tasha grinned like a proud coach and said, "Parents will see where every dollar breathes." Jade traced the faded court lines and said, "These lines taught me to stop running." A child bounced a ball nearby, curiosity bright as noon. Malcolm said, "He is the return on this risk." Jade laughed light and said, "Then let's invest harder." The scoreboard flickered again, and this time it held. At noon, Cassandra arrived with a careful smile, and she said, "I prefer proof to apology." Jade offered the live dashboard and said, "Every invoice, every timeline, every change order." Malcolm added, "Community Oversight Committee meets bi-weekly here." Cassandra studied the numbers like constellations finally named. She said, "Deliver this tempo through summer, and my pledge doubles." Tasha raised a brow and said, "Add mentorship hours, not just money." Cassandra considered and said, "Agreed. I'll bring interns and technicians." Jade felt a knot release and said, "Thank you for betting on work, not rumors." "Oh." Cassandra's nod held respect, not charity, and the room exhaled hope. Evening found them on the refurbished steps, and Marcus hovered at the curb like a lesson unlearned. He said, "You think you won because rich friends clapped." Jade kept her voice even and said, "I won when I chose boundaries over begging." Malcolm stayed close, but let her lead. Marcus tried a softer key and said, "I can help paint, earn something back." Tasha stepped forward and said, "Accountability is labor plus time, not theater." Jade nodded and said, "If you show up sober and steady for 30 days, we talk." Marcus lifted his hands, half surrender, half habit. He said, "Then I'll start tomorrow." She said, "Start now by leaving without chaos." The twilight kept their peace intact. Night draped the penthouse in quiet bravery, and Jade said, "Today felt like choosing myself without apology." Malcolm set blueprints aside and said, "And choosing us without fear." The city purred against the glass like a loyal witness. Jade said, "I used to think love was rescue, now I know it is practice." He smiled, tired and certain, and said, "Practice turns truth into muscle." She moved into his arms and let the day drain away. He said, "Whatever tomorrow demands, we answer together." Jade pressed her forehead to his and said, "Together is my favorite honest word." The room grew warm around their promise, and the night finally learned to rest. Dawn spilled like gold across the penthouse glass, and Jade said, "Peace feels fragile, but real." Malcolm leaned against the frame and said, "Fragile things last longer when held with care." The skyline stretched wide, promising and endless. Jade said, "My scars no longer whisper shame. They remind me I survived." He touched her shoulder and said, "And you built beauty where ruin tried to live." Silence stretched, comfortable as a quilt. She turned toward him and said, "So what now?" He smiled gently and said, "Now we live, not just endure." Her laugh carried sunlight, breaking the last of the storm. Later at the community center, children's laughter echoed off fresh paint. Jade said, This sound is the return on every risk. Tasha waved from the bleachers and said, "See." Thunder gave way to music. Malcolm crouched to help a child lace sneakers and said, "Every small win stacks into forever." Jade's heart swelled as she said, "Forever feels less like a dream, more like a choice." The scoreboard lit fully, no flicker this time, steady as a heartbeat. Tasha called, "Your victory is louder than his shadow now." Jade smiled, knowing scars had shifted into strength. Marcus arrived quietly at the back door, eyes heavier than usual. He said, 30 days sober, 30 days present. Jade studied him, her heart torn between doubt and tired love. She said, "Trust is not instant, it is earned brick by brick." Malcolm's arm brushed hers and said, "She owes you no forgiveness, only terms." Marcus nodded, softer than before, and said, "Then let me sweep floors until the court shines." Tasha eyed him like steel and said, "We'll count your hours, not your promises." Jade finally said, "If you mean it, stay, if not, leave clean." The air thickened, waiting for his choice. That evening, the gala lights felt different, less hostile. Cassandra clinked her glass and said, "Tonight we honor progress, not rumor." Jade stood at the podium and said, "I am not here to erase scars, but to prove survival can be art." The crowd leaned in, drawn closer. Malcolm stood at her side, presence steady as a pillar. Tasha cheered loudly, refusing to be quiet. Cassandra smiled, rare and real, and said, "You turned storms into infrastructure." Applause swelled, not for performance, but for proof. Jade's heart steadied under the roar, no longer fragile, only fierce. Later that night, Jade and Malcolm stood on the balcony, overlooking the city hum. She said, "For so long, I feared endings. Now I see beginnings hide inside them." He brushed her cheek and said, "You were never smoke, you were fire learning its shape." Her breath trembled and said, "And you were not ruin, but refuge." Silence lingered, tender and vast. She leaned into him and said, "Love is not the rescue, it is the rebuilding." He kissed her forehead, and the city exhaled with them. The night closed, not with silence, but with a vow stitched into eternity.